David Williams had been dreaming about owning lakefront property for as long as he could remember. Every weekend he would drive past the fancy neighborhoods with their perfect lawns and private docks, wondering what it would feel like to wake up to the sound of water lapping against the shore. At 45 years old, he had spent the last 20 years building his construction company from the ground up, working 16-hour days and saving every penny he could. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March. His real estate agent, Patricia, could barely contain her excitement. She had found something special, a 100-year-old ranch house sitting on 15 acres of prime waterfront property. The place had been in the same family for 3 generations, but the elderly owner had finally decided to sell and move closer to his grandchildren in Florida. David drove out to see the property that same afternoon. The moment he turned down the long gravel driveway lined with oak trees, he knew this was it. The house was nothing fancy, a single-story ranch with white siding that needed a fresh coat of paint and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. But the location was absolutely perfect. The property stretched right down to the water's edge, with a private dock and boat launch that looked like it had been there forever. Patricia walked him through the house, pointing out the hardwood floors that just needed refinishing and the kitchen that could use some updating. But David wasn't really listening. He kept looking out the windows at the lake, imagining himself sitting on the dock with a cup of coffee in the morning, watching the sunrise paint the water gold. The best part was the price. The family was asking for less than half of what similar waterfront properties were going for. The catch was that they wanted a quick sale, cash only, and they needed to close within 30 days. For most people, that would have been impossible. But David had been saving for years, and his construction business had been doing well. He could make it work. That evening, he called his daughter Angela, who was studying law at the state university. She had always been his voice of reason, the one who kept him grounded when he got too excited about something. "Dad, it sounds amazing," she said after he described the property. "But have you looked into the neighborhood?" "What about the HOA?" Most lakefront communities have pretty strict rules. David had to admit he hadn't thought about that. The next morning, he called Patricia to ask about homeowner associations and community rules. She assured him that the property was grandfathered in. It had been there long before any of the fancy developments went up around the lake. The deed was clear about his rights to the water, and there shouldn't be any issues. Still, David decided to do his homework. He spent the next week researching everything he could about the area. The lake was called Sunset Bay, and it was surrounded by several different neighborhoods. On the north side was Sunset Bay Estates, a gated community with million-dollar homes and perfectly manicured lawns. To the east was Willowbrook, a more modest development of 2-story houses with shared lake access. And scattered around the rest of the lake were older properties like the one he was buying, homes that had been there since before the area became popular. The more he learned, the more confident he became. His property had what lawyers called riparian rights, basically the legal right to use the water because his land touched the shore. These rights were written into his deed and couldn't be taken away by any homeowner association. The inspection went smoothly. The house was solid, built with good bones that would last another 100 years with proper care. The dock needed some work, but nothing David couldn't handle himself. The boat launch was in surprisingly good condition, with a concrete ramp that led right into deep water. 2 weeks later, David found himself sitting at a conference table in a lawyer's office, signing papers that would make him the proud owner of 15 acres of paradise. The elderly seller, Mr. Peterson, shook his hand with tears in his eyes. "You take good care of this place," Peterson said. "My grandfather built that dock with his own hands back in 1952. The fishing's been good to our family for 3 generations. I hope it treats you just as well." David spent the next month getting the house ready to move into. He repainted the exterior, fixed the sagging porch, and refinished those beautiful hardwood floors. Every morning he would arrive at sunrise with his coffee and his lunch, working until the sun set over the water. It was the most peaceful he had felt in years. His neighbors seemed friendly enough. The people in Willowbrook waved when they saw him working in the yard. The folks from Sunset Bay Estates were a bit more standoffish, but that was fine with him. He wasn't looking to make best friends with everyone. He just wanted to enjoy his piece of the lake. On moving day, David stood on his new dock and watched the moving truck disappear back down the gravel driveway. His furniture looked a bit sparse in the big old house, but it felt like home already. He had bought a small fishing boat the week before. Nothing fancy, just a reliable 18-footer with a quiet motor that would let him explore every corner of the lake. That first evening, as he grilled a burger on his new back porch, David couldn't help but smile. After 20 years of hard work and sacrifice, he had finally made it. He owned a piece of the American dream, a home on the water where he could fish every morning, host barbecues for his family, and maybe even teach his future grandchildren how to tie fishing knots. As the sun set over Sunset Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, David raised his beer in a silent toast to Mr. Peterson and his grandfather, who had built this little piece of paradise. He had no idea that some of his new neighbors were already making plans to make his life very difficult. For now, he was just a man living his dream, looking forward to many peaceful years on the water. The lake was calm that night, reflecting the stars like a perfect mirror. David fell asleep to the gentle sound of small waves touching the shore, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing just across the water. David woke up that first Saturday morning in his new home, feeling like a kid on Christmas Day. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, turning the lake into a sheet of gold. He had been planning this moment for weeks, his first real fishing trip from his own dock. He made a quick cup of coffee, grabbed his tackle box and fishing rod, and headed down to the water. His boat started on the first try, purring quietly as he backed away from the dock. The morning air was crisp and clean, and the only sounds were the gentle hum of his motor and the occasional splash of a fish jumping somewhere in the distance. This was exactly what he had dreamed about during all those long days building his business. David found a quiet spot about 200 yards from shore, where the water was deep, and the fish finder on his boat showed plenty of activity below. He cut the engine and dropped anchor, then cast his line into the peaceful water. Within minutes, he felt the familiar tug of a fish taking his bait. A nice bass, maybe 2 pounds, fought hard before he reeled it in. This was going to be a perfect morning, but his peaceful moment was about to be shattered. The sound of powerful boat engines approaching made him look up from his fishing line. 3 expensive-looking speedboats were heading straight toward him, moving fast enough to create wakes that rocked his smaller boat. The lead boat had Sunset Bay Patrol painted on the side in official-looking letters. The boats formed a triangle around David's fishing boat, their engines idling loudly. The people on board were all dressed like they were heading to a country club. Polo shirts, khaki pants, and sunglasses that probably cost more than David's fishing rod. The woman on the lead boat stood up and spoke through a megaphone, even though they were close enough to have a normal conversation. "Excuse me, sir. I need to see your authorization for being on this lake." David looked around, confused. Authorization? He was fishing from his own property, using the dock that came with his house. "I'm sorry, what kind of authorization?" The woman lowered her megaphone and spoke in the tone of voice teachers use with difficult children. "This is a private community lake. All boat access requires approval from the Sunset Bay Estates Homeowners Association and payment of annual lake fees. I'm Victoria Sterling, president of the HOA board." David felt his stomach drop, but he tried to stay calm. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. I own the property right over there." He pointed toward his dock. "I have riparian rights to this water." "It's written right into my deed." Victoria's expression didn't change. She looked like someone who was used to getting her way and didn't appreciate being questioned. "I don't care what you think your deed says. This entire lake is managed by our association. You need to submit an application, pay the fees, and wait for approval before you can operate any watercraft on these waters." The man on the second boat leaned forward. He was wearing a captain's hat that looked like it had never seen a real day of boating. "We've been watching you move in all month. We assumed you would come to the office to get properly registered. This lake has rules and everyone needs to follow them." David's construction experience had taught him to stay calm when people tried to push him around. There were always building inspectors, city officials, and property owners who thought they could intimidate contractors. He had learned to stick to the facts and not let emotions take over. "I appreciate your concern about lake safety," he said politely, "but my property has been here since 1952. The riparian rights were established long before your association existed. I have every legal right to use this water." Victoria's face was turning red now. "Legal right? Let me tell you what your legal right is. Your legal right is to follow the same rules as everyone else in this community. We don't care how long that old shack has been sitting there. Rules are rules. The third boat had been quiet until now, but the elderly man operating it finally spoke up. "Son, I think you're misunderstanding how things work around here. This isn't some public fishing hole. This is a high-end community with standards. We maintain this lake, we stock it with fish, and we keep it clean. That costs money, and everyone who uses it needs to pay their fair share." David felt his temper starting to rise, but he forced himself to stay professional. "I understand that you folks have invested in maintaining the lake, and I respect that. But legally, I own the rights to use this water. I'm not trying to cause any problems. I just want to fish from my own property." Victoria raised her megaphone again. "Well, let me make this very clear. If you don't remove your boat from this lake immediately and report to our office to begin the proper registration process, I will be forced to call the authorities. We have agreements with the local sheriff's department to enforce our lake regulations." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire. David looked around at the 3 boats surrounding him, at the angry faces of people who clearly saw him as some kind of invader. These weren't the friendly neighbors he had hoped to meet. These were people who thought they owned the entire lake and everyone on it. But David had not worked 20 years to buy his dream home just to be bullied on his first day of fishing. He picked up his phone and started recording the conversation. "Ma'am, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You're threatening to call the police because I'm fishing from my own property?" Victoria noticed the phone and her expression got even angrier. "Put that away. We don't allow unauthorized filming of our patrol activities." "This isn't your patrol activity," David replied, keeping his voice steady. "This is harassment of a property owner who is legally using his own water rights, and I have every right to document it." The man in the captain's hat gunned his engine, sending a large wake toward David's boat. "You better watch your attitude, buddy. We run a peaceful community here, and we don't need troublemakers stirring things up." David held onto his boat as it rocked from the wake. These people were actually trying to intimidate him with their boats. It was like something out of a bad movie, except it was happening to him in real life. "I'm not trying to stir up anything," he said. "I just want to fish. But if you keep threatening me and trying to run me off water that I have legal rights to use, then we're going to have a much bigger problem." Victoria turned to the other boats. "Let's go. We'll let the proper authorities handle this situation." She looked back at David with the kind of smile that promised trouble. "Enjoy your fishing while you can. We'll see how long your attitude lasts when you're dealing with the sheriff." The 3 boats roared away, leaving David alone on the water with his heart pounding and his peaceful morning completely ruined. He sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. These people actually thought they could order him off the water at his own property. They had threatened to call the police like he was some kind of criminal. David reeled in his line and headed back to his dock. His first morning of fishing had turned into his first taste of what living in this neighborhood was really going to be like. As he tied up his boat, he looked across the water, toward the fancy houses of Sunset Bay Estates, and realized that his peaceful lakefront retirement might be a lot more complicated than he had planned. But David Williams hadn't gotten where he was by backing down from bullies. If these people wanted a fight, they were about to learn that they had picked on the wrong person. The following Saturday morning, David decided he wasn't going to let a bunch of bullies keep him from enjoying his own property. He had spent the week researching his riparian rights and consulting with a lawyer friend who confirmed what he already knew. He had every legal right to use the lake from his own shoreline. The HOA could make all the threats they wanted, but the law was on his side. This time he brought his 19-year-old son, Tyler, along. Tyler was home from community college for the weekend and had been excited to try out his dad's new fishing setup. Father and son loaded up the boat with sandwiches, cold drinks, and enough fishing gear for a full day on the water. David wanted to show Tyler that you don't back down when people try to push you around. "Dad, are you sure about this?" Tyler asked as they pushed off from the dock. "Those people sounded pretty serious when you told me about last weekend." David started the motor and smiled at his son. "Tyler, I didn't work 20 years to buy this place just to let some rich folks tell me I can't use my own water. We have every legal right to be here, and I'm not going to hide in my house because they don't like it." They found a great spot near a fallen tree where the fish finder was showing lots of activity. Within an hour, they had caught 3 nice bass and a couple of bluegill. Tyler was having the time of his life, and David was starting to relax for the first time since the confrontation the previous weekend. Maybe the HOA had gotten their message across and would leave him alone now. But around 10 o'clock, the sound of powerful engines shattered the morning peace. David looked up to see two sheriff's boats approaching fast with emergency lights flashing. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. The HOA had actually called the police just like they had threatened. "Dad, what's going on?" Tyler asked, his voice tight with worry. "Just stay calm, son. We haven't done anything wrong." But David's own voice was shaking as he watched the police boats circle around them like sharks around prey. The lead boat pulled up close enough that David could see the stern expression on the deputy's face. The officer was young, probably not much older than Tyler, but he was wearing the full authority of his badge like armor. "Sir, we need you to cut your engine and prepare to be boarded," the deputy called out through a speaker system that made his voice sound cold and mechanical. David turned off his motor and raised his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "Officer, what seems to be the problem?" The deputy maneuvered his boat alongside David's and stepped across onto the smaller vessel. His partner stayed in the police boat, hand resting casually on his radio. "We received a complaint that you're operating an unlicensed vessel on private community waters without permission. I need to see your boat registration and some identification." Tyler looked terrified, but David tried to project calm confidence as he reached for his wallet and the boat's registration papers. "Officer, there seems to be some confusion. This is my boat, properly registered, and I'm fishing from my own property. I own the land right over there with the White House and the dock." The deputy looked at the registration papers and David's driver's license, comparing the addresses. For a moment, his stern expression softened slightly. "Sir, the complaint we received states that you're trespassing on private HOA waters and operating without proper permits." The caller identified herself as the community security coordinator. "Officer, with all due respect, that caller is wrong," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I own riparian rights to this water. It's written into my property deed. The HOA has no legal authority over my use of the lake from my own shoreline." The second deputy spoke up from his boat. "Do you have documentation of these rights with you?" David felt a flash of frustration. "Officer, I'm fishing from my own property. I don't carry my house deed when I go fishing any more than you carry yours when you drive to work. But I can certainly provide it if needed." The first deputy looked uncomfortable now. He was probably beginning to realize that this wasn't the clear-cut case of trespassing that had been reported to him. "Sir, the complaint also states that your vessel may not be properly licensed for this body of water." David handed over his boat registration again. "This boat is properly registered with the state. I have all required safety equipment on board. You can inspect anything you want." While the deputy looked over the paperwork again, David could see more boats gathering in the distance. Word was spreading that the police were dealing with the troublemaker who had been defying the HOA. It felt like half the neighborhood was watching the show. Tyler was sitting quietly in the bow of the boat, but David could see his hands shaking. His son shouldn't have to go through this just for taking a fishing trip with his father. The anger that David had been holding back started to build. "Officer, I need to ask you something," David said. "Did the person who called this in provide any evidence that I was actually breaking any laws? Or did they just tell you that they didn't want me on the water?" The deputy exchanged a look with his partner. It was clear that they were starting to understand the real situation. "Sir, we respond to all complaints about potential violations. But based on what I'm seeing here, your paperwork appears to be in order. So am I free to continue fishing?" The deputy hesitated. "Sir, we're going to need to verify your property ownership and your claimed water rights before we can make that determination. This appears to be a civil matter that may need to be resolved in court." David felt his temper starting to slip. "Officer, you're telling me that I can't fish from my own property because someone made a phone call claiming I don't belong here? What if I called the police and said that your patrol boat was trespassing? Would you have to prove you had a right to be on the water?" The second deputy stepped onto David's boat now. He was older, probably a sergeant, and his expression suggested he had seen this kind of neighborhood dispute before. "Let me ask you something, sir. Do you have any documentation with you that shows your property boundaries extend to the water?" David pulled out his phone and showed the officer a photo of his property survey that he had taken for insurance purposes. The survey clearly showed his property line extending to the water's edge, with a note about riparian rights. The sergeant studied the photo carefully, then looked at his younger partner. "This appears to be a legitimate property owner exercising riparian rights. Unless there's some other violation we're not seeing, I don't think we have grounds for any enforcement action." But the younger deputy wasn't ready to let it go. "What about the HOA complaint? They said he was operating without proper community authorization. The sergeant shook his head. Son, HOAs can't override state and federal water rights laws. If this man owns property that touches the water, he's got rights that predate any homeowner association. David felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he could see that Tyler was still scared. Officers, am I free to go? My son and I were just trying to have a peaceful morning of fishing. The sergeant nodded. You're free to continue your activities, sir. But I would strongly recommend that you document your property rights and water access clearly. This probably isn't the last time this issue will come up. As the police boats pulled away, David put his arm around Tyler's shoulders. You okay, son? Tyler nodded, but his voice was shaky. Dad, why did they call the police on us? We weren't hurting anybody. David looked across the water toward the expensive houses where he could see people standing on their decks with binoculars, watching the drama unfold. Some people think that having money means they get to make the rules for everyone else. But we have rights too, and we're not going to let them intimidate us. They tried to continue fishing, but the mood was ruined. Every time a boat appeared in the distance, Tyler would tense up, watching to see if it was coming toward them. David realized that the HOA had accomplished their goal even without getting him arrested. They had made his own property feel like a place where he wasn't welcome. As they packed up their gear and headed back to the dock, David made a decision. He wasn't going to let these people drive him away from his dream home. But he also wasn't going to just sit back and let them harass him every time he wanted to use his own lake. If they wanted to play games, he would show them what a real game looked like. That evening, David called his lawyer friend and started making plans. The HOA thought they could use intimidation and false police reports to control him. They were about to learn that David Williams didn't back down from a fight, especially when he was in the right. David spent Sunday afternoon in his home office, surrounded by legal documents, property surveys, and printouts from county websites. The police encounter had lit a fire under him that he hadn't felt since starting his construction business. These people thought they could push him around because he was new to the neighborhood. They were about to learn that underestimating David Williams was a serious mistake. His first call Monday morning was to his lawyer friend, Robert Chen, who specialized in property law. Robert had helped David with business contracts over the years and knew him well enough to hear the determination in his voice. David, I've looked over your deed and the survey you emailed me, Robert said. Your riparian rights are absolutely solid. This HOA has no legal standing to restrict your water access, but you mentioned they threatened you with some kind of community enforcement. That concerns me. What do you mean? David asked. Well, if they're operating some kind of security patrol and making false reports to police, that could be harassment or even abusive process. But more importantly, if they're claiming authority over the entire lake, I'd be curious to see what legal basis they think they have for that. Robert's suggestion got David thinking. That afternoon, he drove to the county courthouse to research the Sunset Bay Estates HOA. What he found in the public records was fascinating. The HOA had been formed 15 years ago when the housing development was built. Their founding documents claimed responsibility for maintaining and managing community lake access facilities. But as David dug deeper, he realized that nowhere in their legal paperwork did it actually give them authority over the entire lake. They had rights to operate their marina and manage access for their own residents, but they had no jurisdiction over other property owners with riparian rights. The more he researched, the more curious he became about the marina itself. On Wednesday evening, he took his boat out for what he called a reconnaissance mission. He stayed well within his legal rights, fishing from areas that were clearly accessible from his property, but he paid close attention to the HOA's marina facilities. What he saw made his construction-trained eye start asking questions. The marina was much larger than it had appeared from a distance. There were nearly 50 boat slips, a fuel dock, a small convenience store, and what looked like a restaurant or clubhouse. For a community of maybe 200 homes, it seemed like overkill. More importantly, David noticed that boats were coming and going that clearly didn't belong to residents of Sunset Bay Estates. There were fishing charters, ski boat rentals, and even a couple of houseboats that looked like they might be vacation rentals. The HOA wasn't just running a marina for their own residents. They were operating what looked like a commercial business. That evening, David called his daughter Angela for advice. She was in her last year of law school and had been following his HOA troubles with interest. Dad, if they're running commercial operations, they need all kinds of permits and licenses. she said. Marina operations, fuel sales, restaurant service. That's heavily regulated at both state and federal levels. You should check with the Environmental Protection Agency, too. Marinas can't just be built anywhere without extensive environmental review. Angela's suggestion sent David down a new research path. Thursday morning, he spent 3 hours on the phone with various government agencies. What he learned was shocking. The Department of Environmental Protection had no record of permits for a marina at Sunset Bay. The State Commerce Department had no business license on file for fuel sales or boat rentals. The Health Department had never inspected any restaurant facilities. The Fire Marshal had no records of safety inspections for commercial dock facilities. Friday afternoon, David drove to the county planning office with a simple request. He wanted to see all the permits and approvals for the Sunset Bay Estates Marina. The clerk, a friendly woman named Beverly, spent an hour helping him search through files. "This is odd," Beverly said, frowning at her computer screen. "I'm showing that the development was approved for a small community dock with maybe 10 boat slips for residents only. But you're describing something much larger than that." She pulled up aerial photos from the county's GIS system, comparing images from when the development was first built to current satellite views. "Oh my," she said quietly. "It looks like they've expanded this marina significantly without getting proper approvals." David felt his pulse quicken. "What does that mean exactly?" Beverly pulled up more files. "Well, any expansion beyond the original approved footprint would require new permits, environmental review, setback variances, a whole bunch of stuff. And if they're operating commercially without proper zoning, that's a much bigger problem." She printed out copies of the original development approvals and highlighted the discrepancies. The approved plan showed a simple dock with 10 slips. The current marina was at least 5 times that size and clearly being used for commercial purposes. "Mr. Williams," Beverly said carefully, "if what you're telling me is accurate, this property may be operating in significant violation of county ordinances. I'm going to have to refer this to our Code Enforcement Division." David left the planning office with a folder full of documents and a feeling that the tables were starting to turn. That evening, he called Robert to share what he had discovered. "David, this is potentially huge," Robert said after reviewing the documents. "If they've been operating without proper permits, the county can shut them down immediately. And if they've been collecting money for commercial operations without proper licensing, that's fraud." Over the weekend, David continued his investigation. He drove around the lake early in the morning, taking photos of the marina from different angles. He documented the commercial boats coming and going, the fuel pumps operating without visible permits, and the restaurant serving customers who clearly weren't residents. He also started talking to other property owners around the lake. The folks in Willowbrook were sympathetic but afraid to speak up. Several mentioned that they had been told by the HOA that they couldn't use their own boats on the lake without paying fees to Sunset Bay Estates. An elderly man named Frank, who lived in one of the older houses on the south side, was particularly helpful. "Son, I've been here for 30 years, Frank said. That marina started as just a small dock, but every year it gets bigger. They've been telling everyone that they manage the whole lake, but I never believed it. My property has water rights just like yours." Frank showed David old photos of the lake from before the Sunset Bay development existed. The difference was dramatic. What had once been a quiet community lake was now dominated by a massive commercial marina that seemed to grow larger every year. By Sunday evening, David had assembled a comprehensive file documenting what appeared to be years of illegal expansion and unauthorized commercial operations. He had photos, public records, witness statements, and expert opinions from Robert about the legal violations. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. While researching the HOA's financial records, which were required to be available to property owners in the community, David discovered that the marina operations were generating over $500,000 in annual revenue, money from boat slip rentals, fuel sales, restaurant operations, and fishing guide services, none of which appeared to be properly licensed or permitted. The HOA that had threatened to call the police on him for fishing from his own property was actually running an illegal commercial operation worth hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. They had been so focused on harassing him that they had never noticed he was gathering evidence of their own violations. David sat in his office Sunday night, looking out at the lake where lights from the illegal marina reflected on the water. Victoria Sterling and her HOA board had made a serious mistake when they decided to mess with him. They thought they were dealing with some small-time property owner who would be intimidated by their threats and their fancy boats. They were about to learn that David Williams had spent 20 years in construction, which meant he knew exactly how to deal with people who thought rules didn't apply to them. Tomorrow morning, he would start making some phone calls that would change everything about Sunset Bay. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made David remember why he had fallen in love with lakefront living. But instead of heading out for a peaceful morning of fishing, he was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of documents that would change everything about Sunset Bay. His first call was to the County Code Enforcement Office. The supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Carol Martinez, listened carefully as David explained what he had discovered about the Marina's unpermitted expansion and illegal commercial operations. "Mr. Williams, these are serious allegations," Carol said. "I'm going to send an inspector out there this week to document what you've described. If even half of what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at multiple violations that could result in immediate shutdown orders." David's second call was to the State Environmental Protection Agency. The Marina's expansion had filled in wetlands and altered the shoreline without any environmental review. The fuel operations were potentially contaminating the lake without proper containment systems. A state inspector promised to coordinate with the county to investigate within days. By Wednesday, the machinery of government enforcement was rolling into action. David watched from his dock as official vehicles with county and state government plates pulled up to the marina. Inspectors with clipboards and cameras spread out across the facility, documenting every violation they could find. The first shutdown order came that afternoon. The fuel pumps were immediately closed for operating without environmental permits. The restaurant was shuttered for lack of health department approvals. All commercial boat rental operations were suspended pending proper licensing. Victoria Sterling called an emergency HOA board meeting for Thursday evening. David could see cars arriving at the clubhouse across the lake, and he imagined the panic that must be setting in as board members realized the scope of their legal problems. Friday morning brought the big hammer. The county planning department issued a stop work order for the entire marina facility and demanded that all expansions beyond the original approved footprint be removed within 90 days. The environmental agency filed formal charges for wetlands violations and contamination risks. The phone calls started that afternoon. First, it was Victoria Sterling herself, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Mr. Williams, I think we got off on the wrong foot," she said. "Perhaps we can work out some kind of arrangement that would be mutually beneficial." David let her talk for a few minutes about community cooperation and finding common ground, then cut her off politely. "Ms. Sterling, 3 weeks ago you threatened to have me arrested for fishing from my own property. Now you want to negotiate?" "We were just trying to maintain community standards," she said, her voice getting higher. "We had no idea about your property rights situation." "You had no idea about a lot of things, apparently," David replied, "including the law." The next call came from the HOA's lawyer, attempting to sound authoritative while clearly fishing for information about what David knew and what he wanted. David referred him to Robert Chen and hung up. But the most interesting call came Saturday morning from a man named Thomas Peterson, the grandson of the elderly gentleman who had sold David the property. Thomas lived in California now, but he had been following the situation through mutual friends around the lake. "Mr. Williams, I wanted you to know that my family has been watching what's been happening over there," Thomas said. "My grandfather always said that Marina was getting too big for its britches. He would have been proud to see someone finally stand up to them." Thomas had information that David hadn't expected. "Mr. Williams, did you know that my grandfather actually owned part of the land where that marina sits? He sold it to the development company back in the 1990s, with specific restrictions about how it could be used. I've got copies of those deed restrictions if you're interested." The deed restrictions were like finding buried treasure. The original sale specifically limited the marina to small-scale community boat storage for residential use only, and prohibited any commercial operations. The HOA had been violating the terms of their own property deed for years. Over the next month, the situation for Sunset Bay Estates went from bad to catastrophic. The environmental violations resulted in fines of over $200,000. The unpermitted construction required expensive remediation work. The illegal commercial operations triggered tax penalties and business license violations, but the real blow came when the insurance company discovered that the HOA had been operating commercial facilities without proper coverage. They immediately canceled the policy and demanded repayment of claims related to marina operations over the past 5 years. The HOA called a special assessment meeting in November, asking each homeowner to pay an additional $15,000 to cover the mounting legal and remediation costs. The community that had been so united in their hostility toward David was now turning on each other as the bills kept climbing. David watched it all unfold from his deck, where he spent peaceful mornings drinking coffee and fishing from his legal, permitted, and properly documented dock. The lake was quieter now without all the commercial boat traffic, and the fishing had actually improved. The final blow came in December. Facing bankruptcy from the fines and legal costs, the HOA was forced to sell the marina property to pay their debts. The sale was handled through the county foreclosure process, and David had been watching the proceedings with great interest. On the day of the auction, David arrived at the courthouse with a cashier's check and a business plan he had been developing for weeks. The marina property was being sold for a fraction of its former value because of all the legal complications and required remediation work. David's winning bid was less than half of what the marina had been worth before the violations were discovered. He now owned 47 boat slips, a fuel dock that could be properly permitted, and a restaurant building that could be renovated to legal standards. The first thing David did as the new marina owner was install a large sign at the entrance. Sunset Bay Marina. Welcome all boaters. No discrimination. No HOA required. He hired Frank, the elderly gentleman from the south side of the lake, as his part-time marina manager. The second thing he did was send a letter to every property owner around the lake, informing them that their riparian rights were fully respected and that anyone with legal water access was welcome to rent a boat slip at fair market rates. Victoria Sterling and several other board members moved away from Sunset Bay within 6 months. The remaining residents formed a new, smaller HOA focused on maintaining their own community amenities, rather than trying to control the entire lake. On a warm Saturday morning in April, exactly 1 year after that first confrontation on the water, David stood on the deck of his marina office watching his son Tyler help a family of tourists launch their rental boat. The lake was busy but peaceful, with boats of all sizes enjoying the water without harassment or intimidation. An elderly couple walked up to the marina counter to inquire about boat rentals. They were visiting their grandchildren in Willowbrook and wanted to take them fishing. "Any requirements or restrictions we need to know about?" the grandfather asked. David smiled and handed him the rental agreement. "Just 2 rules here, sir. Everyone has equal access to the water, and everyone treats each other with respect. That's how we keep things peaceful on Sunset Bay." As the couple headed out on the lake with their excited grandchildren, David reflected on the past year. He had bought his dream home planning to live quietly and fish peacefully. Instead, he had been forced to fight for his rights and had ended up owning the very marina that had been used to threaten him. The best part wasn't the financial success of the marina business, though that was certainly nice. The best part was watching families enjoy the lake without fear of harassment, knowing that bullies couldn't control the water anymore. David had learned that sometimes when people try to take away your rights, the best response is to make sure they can never threaten anyone else's rights again. That evening, as the sun set over Sunset Bay, David sat on his dock with a fishing rod and a cold beer, listening to the gentle sound of water lapping against his legally documented, properly permitted, and completely peaceful shoreline. It had been a long journey from that first confrontation with the HOA boats, but sometimes the best victories are the ones where justice is served with a side of poetic irony.